The first story. He cut off my tail. 48 hours are nothing more important than the first 48. I look at arrows rushing in a doomed circle, 3 minutes until there will be no trace of hope. Where are you, little brother? At first, I expected him to be at 6. Sometimes he stayed after school with his friend, Mitka. We called them M&Ms. He lived very close to us in the house next door. Mishka rarely called him over to his place because his brother, Mitka, only had a kindly grandmother and delicious, hot borscht. What about us? My mother works until the evening. She's good, but my father works a lot and even on shifts. So I'm the one in charge. At 6, the TV program was interrupted by a news story. That woke me up. I had left Mishka's cutlets to cook. The pasta was already boiling by then. I called my brother. Of course, it's stupid, but that's just how our brains work. He tries to avoid the strange things that are happening. He's searching for a way to cut it off and explain it. Hiding? I wondered then. He loves to do that, and we're similar in that way. I remember terrifying my parents in the 2nd grade with a banal story about the top shelf of a closet and towels and sheets. I fell asleep, and they searched for me for a long time, but in the end, they didn't find me. I had to save them. Wow, my father hit me then. He loves this job and I hide, so he hits me after. That's probably for the best, because after the birth of my brother, my dad moved away from us, and thank goodness for that. Mish? I just looked around. The floor sparkled, almost glistened. Only the bear wasn't there. A strange feeling of anxiety. She was like an echo, an oncoming train that I knew would arrive on schedule. All I had to do was wait. Mish, come out, please. I spoke with a pinch of anger in my voice. The surest way to get rid of anxiety is to get angry. There were only 20 centimeters between the fridge and the wall, but I checked there too. Although Mishka had recently turned 7, nobody gave him more than 5. He was short, tiny. His arms were thin, his legs were thin. We differed in that. Both now and when I was a child, I was known for being well fed. We were also different in how we were painted. Mishka was like the sun, blonde, pale, with blue eyes. But I was just like my father, as my mother often said. Why the father? That's unclear. My mom had brown eyes and dark skin too. And where did the bear go? I sometimes asked sarcastically to know. Nobody was hiding behind the fridge. Nor on the shelves. There's nothing behind the couch. The train's expected to arrive in 10 minutes. I didn't plan to panic that quickly. What nonsense. A big deal. I'd been at Mitka's for a half hour. The chicken cutlets in the kitchen had gone completely stale. Switching off the heat under them, I picked up my cell phone off the table. I should have called him straight away. I scolded myself. But that's just how our brains work. Beeps sounded at regular intervals, but sometimes it felt to me like too much time had passed between the last one and the next. Hello? I spoke hesitantly, but there was still no answer. I dialed again. My legs took me from the kitchen to the living room with excitement. Well, or the gym, as my mom calls it. The train has arrived. And there it was, panic. My left ear that was free of my buzzing phone heard another ring. Mishkin's. From his bedroom. If I had called before, maybe I would not have been so afraid at that moment. I would have thought, Mishka, you're hiding. But I have already gone through this stage. Mishka wasn't at home. There were no boots, no blue coat. And there was a cell phone. I burst into my brother's room like a tornado. The sound was coming from the closet. 5 minutes earlier, I had already checked there, but now I didn't understand how I could have missed Mishka's backpack. Perhaps it was because of the color? My mother and I had bought this dark brown leather bag for him on the 1st of September this year. Like spies. Mishka admired, before there had been the season of superheroes and, even earlier, dinosaurs. But Mishka had stuck to spies for a long time. I wanted to be like Sterlitz. I wanted to be like Sterlitz, he begged. Well, Sterlitz, so Sterlitz it is. Bought and presented. And that was only the beginning. Then came the codes. Yaka bayaka prika veka kayuka. Mishka exclaimed, laughing. What? I said, pretending to be dumb. Taika duka rakik. Mishka wouldn't stop. You're a fool too. I had to stop him. He was upset that, as it turned out, his super spy secret code had long been known by everyone. I told him about Morse code, but I didn't expect him to get involved. I hoped he would just play a little while and then quit. But that didn't happen. ... dash, dash, dash. When the words were still okay. Then, the tapping started. Hands on the table, feet on the ground. Of course, I was indignant, although rarely. Once, in an elevator, when we were going up with our neighbor from above, Misha, seeing a spectator in his face for his new skill, began tapping the elevator panel. Good afternoon to you as well, the man answered him. I did not even know his name. As a matter of fact, my neighbors and I did not communicate much. I disconnected the call. Misha, I shouted for some reason. Fear is like light. It cannot be touched and does not exist on its own. Fear only radiates, and from what exactly, it is up to you to decide. Some people are afraid of the dark, some are afraid of spiders, and some an ordinary school backpack. Misha, my voice was trembling. I dialed another number. Mikin, or rather, his grandmother. Do you have Misha? I would usually say hello first in a normal situation, but I could not call her that. How not? The briefcase I had been looking at laughed at me. Misha. I shouted for the umpteenth time as I hung up the phone. In response, only silence was my second source of fear. I looked around Misha's room, but nothing else mocked me except for a slightly rumpled bed and a table with sheets of Morse code. And next to them, there was a glass. I had not noticed him either while I was looking for my brother. After all, I had been looking for my brother, not this stupid glass which, at that very second, when I touched it, was still slightly warm. Warm. I returned from the institute at 17:30, and hot tea cools off in 45 minutes. So, we had missed Misha by only 5 minutes. It took me the same amount of time to get dressed and rush outside. Another 15 minutes later, I managed to run around our entire neighborhood and several neighboring houses. I checked the nearest shops, but they were empty. Or rather, they were crowded, but Misha wasn't visible among all those strange faces. I was running, and when I stopped, I heard my heart beating loudly. Then I started walking, but the beats did not get any quieter. In my life, there have been times when I was afraid. And then, everything got better and passed, and I thought to myself, what are you doing? You idiot. I wanted to return and not waste time with empty worries. Now, remembering this advice, I could not help but follow it. However, I couldn't. That is all. Lanterns were lit in the courtyard where I was standing. It was 7 o'clock at night. I yelled out loud, 7 o'clock. I had wasted almost an hour already. And then everything was as usual. There were police, searches, and interviews. I spent the entire first night on my feet. Get some rest, the major advised me. I had no idea how he imagined it. But I walked up to my apartment several times to search for my brother's belongings and for myself for warmth. The neighbors who I met at the entrance showed me sympathy. Some by word, some by deed. Hold on, the one from above encouraged me. He even gave me a hug. Tight. But he didn't tell me what to hold on to. For hope? For what? That the bear had just run away and would be back soon? Of course, he was a boy with strange habits. Strange, like my mother used to say. Let's at least try Morse code again, at least. When Misha learned how to not only reproduce it, but also capture it, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The constant tapping had stopped. But these very strange habits began. The dog barks like a Morse code. My brother woke me in the middle of the night a week ago. What? I was indignant. The dog's barking was really getting to us then. It came from nowhere, without warning, and it was terribly disturbing for us to sleep. Most importantly, it was unclear from which apartment it came. From below or from above? I thought I would meet someone with a dog at the entrance and ask them. But that never happened. I also didn't dare call the apartments. In general, I didn't often communicate with my neighbors. The dog barks like Morse code. My brother repeated when I woke up. Mishka, she just barks. Go back to bed. I replied. Yes, he is a strange bear. I came up with such an idea. But to leave? No, that's not his case. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when I finally returned home, it was still dark outside. On the streets and in the apartment, too. Only Mishka's bedroom was illuminated. A nightlight in the form of a white duck protruding from an outlet. Mishka was very scared of the dark. We had even switched rooms with him so that he could be closer to the bathroom. I usually stay up until nightfall, and from the hallway, a stomping bear jumps to the toilet to overcome his fears. Where would it run off to? I have rarely had to cry in my life. As a child, a little, at school when there was a fight. Sometimes on films. But when I entered my brother's room that morning, I was overcome with tears. I saw the room empty and the tears flowed. Thoughts and ideas about where he could be and what had happened to him attacked me. For years, I have lived a life. I know a lot about the world and filth. And suddenly, around the bear, it all began to appear. It was like he had been swallowed by my fantasies, so scary. But I hadn't told my mom anything yet. I thought maybe I had run away after all. Maybe it would be like that. I couldn't find him. Is he missing? Was her first question after my confession. Yes. I'm on my way, she said, and Mom hung up. The train, filled with anxiety, sat on the tracks inside my heart and didn't think to move forward. And the train carrying my mom was racing thousands of kilometers away from our city. On the second night, I finally got some sleep. Not only because of my incredible fatigue, but also because the dog stopped barking. Thanks to her for that. In my dream, I dreamed of a bear. I was searching for him in my dreams, too, but eventually found him there. On the top shelf of the closet. When I woke up, my first action was to check there, even though I knew that was useless. As it turned out, cruel reality, and now, only a minute remained of the precious 48 hours. If the door did not open in the next 60 seconds and there was no bear behind it, according to statistics, the likelihood of finding it would drop to a low probability. 58. 59. 60. That was it. I fell to my knees. I thought this only happened in movies. It was dramatic. But it was real. I started to cry. The alarm had already been completely silenced, and a train had arrived in its place full of despair. It had always seemed to me that hopelessness was a rather harmless creature. I did not know it had fangs as sharp as those. Dragging myself to Mishka's room, I sat at the table. Without asking me, my hands began to fumble around on the surface. What did they want to find? I do not know. But that is how our minds work. They try to occupy themselves, distract us from the important things. Our eyes were not so far behind them either. Save me, they said, and on top of that, there were dots and dashes. I picked up that piece of paper and eventually calmed them down. But then, when I read the next line, I started trembling again. Me. Save me, it said. I jumped to my feet. Another alarm. The text ended there, leaving only dots and dashes behind. What on earth? I asked Leaf. Of course, he didn't answer me. But the alphabet was right there, right in front of us. Dash, dash, dash is about. I turned my head up and down. I scribbled down the letters. Dot, dash is in, dot, 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 dash is why, he's gonna kill me. This is just some childish game, that thought was spinning around in my head, but it was no longer possible to stop me. He's gonna kill me. I read it. I also figured out the letter T, though, so it was pretty clear what kind of word it was. Maybe, like with 60 seconds left, I was still hoping. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, but I do enjoy books and movies that involve mystical themes. However, when I glared at the terrible line, for a brief moment, I had no doubts. I believed. Yes, indeed. Misha. I shouted again. He started to look around. That's why the stream of people interested in the paranormal will never dry up. Armies of psychic mediums and their followers. In times of vulnerability, we're all susceptible to their influence. Our reason and common sense can't save us from falling prey to grief, a fall that will never end. So I bought it. The horror seeped into my bones, as cold as ice. My teeth were chattering. Where are you? We were playing hide and seek again. Only this time, if the bear wasn't found, it wouldn't pop out from under the nightstand with a cheerful cry from the winter. It wouldn't jump out from behind the curtains. It would never come back. I took a deep breath and let it out more quickly. It was not over yet. Help me, was another line. This year, December had not been as harsh as it might have been. However, the heating had also been good. But the sweat on his forehead only belonged to fear. M. I sh. I was afraid to move on. I did not want to raise my head. However, the letter A had already been encountered. Help me, Misha. No, this letter was not meant for me. It had been written by his brother and was intended for him. He's hitting me, Misha. Will you save me? I could feel the pencil beginning to slip out of my hands. Sure enough, he was there. It was just that my fingers were completely numb. He cut off my tail. When will you save me, Misha? Come now, there is no one else. I'm here. Over the words, I could see my brother's face. My little brother, who adored cats, puppies, and all four-legged animals, who was like the sun, bright and kind. That's why I didn't see him on the street. That's why we never crossed paths in the yard. Misha never even came out of the door. Dog, Morse code, I repeated to myself. A friend from the past, who, like the last idiot, missed everything in the world. You idiot. I ran down the stairs in my slippers. 10 steps, 1, 20 steps, 2. And now I stand at the door. Full of animal madness, for some reason I ring the bell. I let myself knock with my fists, when after about 30 seconds no one answers. I kick the door with my feet until it finally gives up. What? The neighbor's head peeks out. The same one who hugged me tightly. The one who... Where is Misha? I pull the door toward me. I don't let it close. This neighbor is just an old man. Ugly, decrepit, and just in a bathrobe. Get out, he shouts at me. He grabs the door handle. His big belly is exposed as he starts to walk from side to side. I can see pieces of eggs in his beard. Where's Misha? I'm afraid. I'm afraid that I've wasted so much time. And now it seems like nothing can be changed. I hit him in the face. It was a stupid thought, but I really didn't want to touch that person. I swung my foot and hit them right in the stomach. At first, it seemed like my foot would get stuck, but instead, the person fell to the floor. I continued to beat them further. They moaned and screamed. I didn't care. All my thoughts were, if only it wasn't so late. I walked into the apartment and it smelled bad. Or maybe that was just my imagination and there were traces of blood on the floor, too. Maybe that was just a trick of my mind. Please. I was already talking out loud, imagining a little girl's shoe that was similar to my brother's. And a blue jacket. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't help but wish that God existed. I wish that he was a protector and benefactor, as he is described in the Bible. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and the light in it was turned off, leaving only darkness like a black haze trying to escape. He's afraid of the dark. I'm shouting for some reason, not even noticing that I'm stuttering. I do not know if sweat is pouring down my cheeks or tears are. I'm going in. I reach for the light switch on the wall. Please. My lips manage to whisper before I scream out. The second story. Bones. Lester was late, having a fight with his mother. She saw him smoking again and screamed for a long time even after he left the house. He had not received the coveted $5 that she had promised for a gift. So he went to his friend's party empty-handed, carrying a couple of cigarettes that he had picked up off the ground. Lester's family were a bit poor. His mother sold things at a market, and his father, who lived apart, was a firefighter and spent most of his money and time caring for another family. Over the last few years, he had been on his own and often spent the night out, hanging around computer clubs. He got better and better at streetwise things, behaving impudently although he was still childishly overweight at the age of 14. With all these things, he was stronger than most of his peers, and that made them, though reluctantly, fear him. Lester's best friend's name was Douglas, and he turned 13 today. Douglas came from a wealthy family, almost like royalty. Douglas' father was a colonel in the Air Force, and his mother was an elegant housewife. They loved and openly pampered Douglas. His parents also loved themselves, and instead of celebrating with each other, they flew off to Europe for a week, leaving Douglas, who was already officially an adult, alone. "When I was your age," Douglas's father often started, "and things like that, you won't get lost. We walked 10 miles to school every day as kids, and we also cooked our own meals." It is not the first time that Douglas has been left alone. As always, he orders pizza and buys ready-made food from the supermarket. This is what he did on his birthday as well, buying another tiny bottle of whiskey. Douglas' parents cared for him and tried to shield him from people like Lester. But, in fact, he became increasingly drawn to the forbidden world of the streets. He met Lester at a place where people smoked after school. 2 boys from a parallel class were bullying him, but the slightly older and bigger Lester stood up for him. "If you touch him again, I'll tear your heads off," he told them. Douglas was impressed and began to respect the chubby, older Lester. From then on, Douglas saw Lester as his protector, and he felt like some kind of undercover bandit. To Lester, Douglas was not just a rich, smart kid who was easy to influence. He spent money on McDonald's trips, computer clubs, and movies, as well as beer. Every day was a holiday for him. Sometimes he even felt sad about that, and at one point he tried to leave town for Douglas. However, he always called him or came home, no matter how many times the phone in his pocket started to vibrate. Douglas called and asked, "Hey, what's up there? What are you doing?" "Hello, I'm on my way. I've just been busy," Lester said irritably into the phone. "Come on, Robert and I are waiting for you. Food and drinks have already been prepared." "Okay, I will now." After finishing the phone call, Lester started to calculate how long he could stay in Douglas's apartment without being noticed before returning home. There would be a school week in front of him, and then a weekend. After that, the mother would get drunk again and sleep all day, so he could climb home, steal money from her wallet, and change clothes. With those thoughts, he started walking happily. The evening smoothly turned into night, and with the darkness came a rare coolness for late April onto the street. Douglas' house was in a high-end neighborhood. Lester recalled how they had led a normal life 5 years earlier in one of those quiet and cozy homes. Before his father left the family, and his mother started to drink a lot. They were kind then, constantly having fun and lively discussions with each other, like they did on his birthday when they celebrated with the entire family. His mother cooked a turkey, and he remembered her scent, as well as dipping pieces of the turkey in ketchup and eating it with great enthusiasm. Then, they would crunch the bones. At the moment when the bones came to mind, Lester felt uncomfortable as he recalled a big plate full of them. The loving father had been replaced by a tormented man sitting in a chair who, after gorging himself, became somewhat lazily terrifying. The mother was replaced by a silhouette standing in the corner of the kitchen with a glass in her hand. And in the middle of it all, there were bones. Dice, non-gray bones, on a large plate. After half an hour and a few calls from Douglas, Lester finally reached him. He did not want to give anything to Douglas, so he made up a story about how to do it. He went to the front door and rang the bell. Douglas' door opened instantly, and his voice was drunk but cheerful. "Lester." "Hello," he shouted, extending a welcoming hand to Lester. He then began to hug Lester, which made him feel a little uncomfortable. Entering the house, Lester began to remove his shoes. Douglas and Robert, drunk, were running around in their underwear. Lester had visited Douglas' apartment many times and immediately recognized the comforting scent of wealth. "Anyway, I bought you a bottle of good whiskey." However, there were police cars driving past your house. They pulled me over, saw the bottle of whiskey, and, in general, I presented them with a gift and spent all my money to get me out. "Yes, that's okay. Forget about it." "Let's go to the kitchen," said Douglas cheerfully. There, in the ashtray full of cigarette butts, were a couple of smoking cigarettes next to 2 glasses of whiskey mixed with Coke on the bottom. The kitchen table presented a not-appealing sight. A few empty Coke bottles were lying sideways in the open pizza boxes, and pizza crusts and crumbled napkins were scattered randomly nearby. The couple had managed to absorb the spilled Coke and looked like the dead, unknown inhabitants of the sea, washed ashore. In all this chaos, empty cigarette packets stood out, as did a lone, half-empty, pot-belly bottle of cognac and chicken bones. And dice. When Lester saw these things, he froze for a moment and stopped listening to Douglas, who was talking in the background. All he could see now were the bones. Lifeless, gray, somehow maternal, bones. There was a heavy emptiness in his head, like during math lessons. Before them, he lost all thought at once and felt only fear. "I'll clean up now," said Douglas as he stumbled into the kitchen. He casually scooped up the bones, napkins, and empty cigarette packs, placing them in a pizza box and placing it next to the refrigerator on the floor. Tommy and Carrie had been driven home, but Mark and Nick's mother had urgently called them home. "So, it was just the 3 of them staying the night," said Douglas happily. "Why are you so drunk?" asked Lester, staring intently at Douglas. "Yes, we had already drunk 1 bottle with the guys while we were waiting for you," said Douglas and looked at Robert, his classmate, who was inconspicuous and quiet, never going anywhere, agreeing with everyone and being almost there. With Lester's arrival, the smell of doghouse, dirty socks, and cigarettes surrounded them. Douglas could smell it and believed that there was something sacred in it, that it was the blood and the faith of the life that he would one day grow into, and that talking to people like Lester would help him prepare for that. "Pour it," Lester said to Robert, who was starting to fall asleep. He looked at Douglas and nodded to the side. When they left, he told Douglas, in detail and with color, that his mother had kicked him out of the house after an argument and he had no place to go. After hearing this, Douglas asked him to come live with him. Lester smiled, and they returned to the kitchen. Robert, completely intoxicated, was dropping unintelligible words, their frequency resembling a song. Then, quietly, he went limp and fell asleep. Lester sipped his whiskey. By now, Douglas had become noticeably intoxicated. After a few missed drinks, Lester began to feel a bit more cheerful. He started throwing steers from his ashtray at the sleeping Robert. Douglas, barely conscious, begged Lester to stop. Later, Douglas also fell asleep. Lester took another drink and then decided fatherly to drag the sleeping boys into Douglas' room. After doing so, he placed them next to each other. After that, I started to think about what to do. I noticed a marker on the table and painted their backs with it. Then, he turned on Douglas' computer. While his drunk friends were sleeping, he managed to finish off the rest of the whiskey. He watched videos on TikTok and then decided to watch porn and log back into TikTok. After a few hours, out of boredom, he decided to have another drink. He had been to Douglas' house more than once before, so he knew exactly where everything was, and so he decided to switch over to Douglas' father's liquor cabinet. They had done this before, taking a little bit from each bottle, and that's what Lester decided to do. When he entered the hallway, he opened the cabinet where all the alcohol in the house resided. There, he was confronted with a small army of mismatched bottles, triangular, square, and flat, as well as long bottles with red, blue, and green labels. Lester remembered that Douglas had taken out a bottle once with a dried snake in it, and he thought that with so many different bottles, her loss wouldn't even be noticeable. He began to pull out one bottle after another, searching for the right one. I pulled them out until I had completely emptied the contents of the closet onto the floor. There was still no bottle, but Lester had noticed something equally intriguing. A key. "My dad has a safe," he said, "and that's where he keeps his gun. He only took it out a couple of times when we went to shoot at bottles. The gun is definitely in there, but I don't know where the key is." The conversation with Douglas suddenly came back to him. With so much luck, Lester started to quickly replace the bottles, and then he saw the one with a snake inside. Anticipation made him casually pour the rest of the liquid into his glass and drain it in one gulp. A warm sensation spread inside him, and his cheekbones started to hurt unpleasantly. His mouth was filled with saliva, and a sense of nausea began to creep over him. This feeling soon began to overpower others, and he almost threw up, especially after he noticed that there was a long, bone-like object inside the bottle instead of a snake. Aghast, he looked at her and couldn't understand how she had gotten there. Since last time, when they had drunk that stuff, there had still been a small snake, but now he saw bone. Seeing her made him feel like throwing up properly, but instead, he placed the bottle with the bone on the very end of the shelf and ran to the kitchen to smoke. There, he collected his thoughts for a long time and regained his senses. They found the key that had been in his hand the entire time. The gun, he thought happily, and went into the bedroom of Douglas' parents. He remembered that the safe was in the closet and was in no rush. Looking at the photos on the walls of Douglas' beautiful mother and father, he crouched down on all fours and opened the drawer of the nightstand. He took out a silk robe and began to open other drawers. There were all sorts of things in there. When he opened the bottom shelf and reached into it, he felt warm and familiar. He felt the contours of bundles of money. He picked up the items on top and took a closer look. There were around 5 of them, all thick like books that Lester had never considered reading in school. Taking out a bill from one of the stacks, he carefully slid it into his underwear. "One more from here and that'll be it," and he removed another bill from the green envelope. When he had finished, he put everything back and closed the shelf. Then he moved to the closet, where the safe was located. Contrary to his expectations, the safe proved to be a small box, and the coveted pistol was clearly too large to fit inside. Despite this, Lester felt a bit disappointed, and he opened the safe with a heavy heart. What was the extent of his joy when he saw the black handle of the pistol staring at him from inside the safe? What a heavy thing, he thought as he pulled the gun out. With the weight of this gun in his hands and the feeling of its presence, he felt even more weighty than before. It was as if this was a solution to all his problems. In the mirror's reflection, he looked like a true bandit. After assessing himself, Lester stood up straight and aimed the muzzle of the gun at his reflection. He took aim and then turned to the side, then the other, before finally pulling the trigger. For the next 5 minutes, Lester walked around his apartment, pointing his gun at everything. He looked for himself in various mirrors and reflections. I went into the bedroom to wake the sleeping boys. I pointed the gun at Robert first, then at Douglas, and finally at myself in the mirror. Bang, I whispered to myself. I reached the kitchen window and saw my reflection. Bang. His vision became unfocused, and instead of seeing his reflection in the window, he saw a view of the courtyard behind him. There, a single lantern illuminated a field with a path that was shaped like the letter Y. Lester began to think seriously about whether he should leave the house and take a shot. I checked the time on my phone, 2:41. I'll fire in the air, and then I'll run. Everyone is asleep, and no one will have time to do anything. From these thoughts, Lester began to get excited. Quietly putting on his shoes and carefully retrieving the keys from the hook by the front door, he left the house and closed the door very slowly behind him. He first locked the first lock, then the second. He tucked the gun into his belt, just like in the movies. Breathing slowly, I walked down the stairs and into the night. In the quiet of the night, a distant dog barked, but other than that, there were no other sounds. Lester looked at the dark courtyard, at the nearby houses. He peered around as his eyes adjusted to the dark. After a moment, he quickly drew a pistol, aimed it up, and fired. Nothing. To his surprise, contrary to his expectations, the gun did not fire. He tried again, but nothing happened. Then, he started to move the small lever on the side of the gun in every direction possible. At one point, he tried to pull the trigger, but it became stuck. He pulled the lever like he saw in the movie, pulled down the dog, and the gun seemed to taunt him. Lester had completely lost interest in the adventure he'd invented and started to think the gun might be defective. He pulled the trigger, raised it, pulled the bolt, and pulled the trigger once more. When he was no longer waiting and was pressing the machine gun again, the gun fired. A roar so loud it broke the night silence made him involuntarily sit down. My ears were muffled, but even with that veil between us, I could still hear the rising noise of car alarms in the yard. Lights began to come on in the neighboring houses, one after another. The whole street seemed to awake. Lester was already in a state of panic and ran. With shaking hands, he tried to fit the key into the lock, but with fear, he mixed up the house with another one. Come on. Let's go. First, the big key, he thought, still trying to get into the door with shaking hands. In the dim light, he didn't see that the hole in this door was horizontal and not vertical, like on Douglas' door. I also forgot my phone. He thought bitterly. Who's there? A very childish voice came from behind the door. It's Lester, he said impatiently, shifting from one foot to another. And I'm not Douglas. I'm Zach. The childish voice replied. How did you get here? Lester asked, hissing angrily. Where is Douglas or Robert? Who are you? Uncle, are you alone? A child's voice answered, the sound very low, as if they were about 4 years old, somewhere at Lester's knees. He sat down and said quickly, "One. Now open the door." Maybe it was some brother of Douglas, who was sleeping somewhere quietly. Lester thought to himself, "Didn't you hear me shooting? I don't need the police to take me down." Lester became more and more impatient. "You're not the only person there. He also heard your shot, and now he's coming to get you," said a childlike voice, which somehow became very timid. From what he said, Lester felt his stomach turn cold. He pressed the gun tighter to himself and asked, "Who's he?" "Yes." Lester waited for the child outside the door to continue, but they didn't say anything. "What kind of he?" Lester shouted. "The one who walks in the night. He is very stupid and slow. If you stay very quiet, he won't hear you." "It was he who locked me up," said the childish voice from outside the door. "Locked up? He? Does he walk in the night?" All these thoughts made Lester feel uneasy. He tightened his grip on the gun again. "Hey, kid, where are Douglas and Robert? Are they awake?" There was no response. He knocked a couple of times on the door and spoke irritably. "Hey, kid, wake up your friends." Then some strange and slow noises began to spread. "It's him," came a frightened, childish whisper from behind the door. Lester felt even more uncomfortable and turned around. A hefty, pale paw gripped a tree trunk just a couple of houses away and then disappeared into the darkness. Lester froze in terror, listening to the repeated, very scary noises. The noises were as if someone was removing organs from the body, dragging a corpse a little along the ground and forcibly throwing the insides on the asphalt. They were tearing out whole pieces of flesh and throwing them over and over again. "I'm locked in, help me." "Open the door," a child's plaintive voice squeaked. Continuing to feel as if he had been burned, Lester raced through all possible and impossible explanations for what was happening in his mind. "This is not possible," he thought. "Maybe the boys gave me some kind of hallucinogenic substance? How could this be? There are no such large hands, no such people. This does not make sense. There must be an explanation." Lester repeated this to himself over and over. Meanwhile, outside the door, the child kept saying, "Hurry up. You can't let he catch you. Open the door for me. Open the door." The child sounded impatient and quick, Lester couldn't understand what was going on. He could hear a child's voice outside the door, but he couldn't quite make out what they were saying. When he did, he began to back away and point the gun at the door. The voice that had originally sounded at knee level outside the door now came from the top corner of the door. It was a cold and unfriendly sound. Lester was trying not to show any fear. Quietly, he approached the door and listened. There was nothing behind it. He heard them, said a scared child's whispering voice outside the door. "Open the door quick." With shaking hands, Lester pulled on the door handle toward him. The door would not open. "There's a bolt on your side. Take it off," the same childish voice said above Lester's head, outside the door. Lester began to take a closer look, and when he found what was inside the bolt, he nearly screamed. There was a tiny bone, very pale, which he had initially not even noticed. Lester lost interest in continuing the conversation with the person behind the door. During the last few minutes, he had felt so much fear and adrenaline that he began to feel more sober. All the stupor from alcohol began to fade away, and Lester finally realized he was at the wrong door. He suddenly remembered clearly that Douglas lived at 27, but here it was 29. This was not the right house. Suddenly, everything fell into place. "Wait. He is already here." A childish whisper was heard outside the door. Frozen, Lester looked slowly in the direction of the noises. He wanted to take a closer look, but he regretted it. A large, bald, white head with black eyes stared at him. A deformed, bloated face trying to force out a friendly smile, blue veins bulging on his forehead which somehow throbbed erratically. The strange creature began to open its large mouth. Bits of grass and bloody veins of meat could be seen in the open maw. Lester could not remember anything, pulled the bone from the latch and ran into the house. There was still the sound of ripping flesh outside the door. Lester did not understand anything anymore. The gun in his hand did not bring a sense of safety. Inside the house, he immediately realized that there was no child nearby. It was silent, it was dark, and there was an empty hallway ahead. The layout was the same as that of Douglas's house. Lester took a long time before taking a step inside the house. The fear in his heart still made his legs not obey him. He remembered again the gun in his hand. Then, he finally came out of his daze. What immediately caught his eye were the rooms in this house that were larger than expected. He walked through the living room and kitchen. When he reached the second floor, he noticed a room that resembled Douglas's parents'. They were empty and large and very dark, with no wallpaper or patterns on the walls, only gray walls. As Lester's eyes adjusted to the dark, he continued to walk further. The left room, a replica of Douglas' room, was completely dark. He reached the threshold and paused, as if someone was there. He was becoming more and more afraid. He pointed the pistol uncertainly in front of himself. In the morning, he disappears along with my dreams, but at night he brings everything he catches inside the house, including cats, dogs, and people, said a thin, childlike voice from somewhere in the darkness, which seemed to be somewhere on the ceiling. Numb with horror, Lester could not breathe. He continued to look into the total darkness of the room. "You don't leave the door," said the voice. "Now he knows what you look like. Be better here," it continued. "Shall we play?" "No one has ever played with me," replied Lester, his voice trembling with fear. "They said to go away," the voice said in the dark, almost like a child. The sound of a car engine began to echo through the street. The car passed by the windows, and a streak of light slowly crept across the large room, illuminating everything. She moved left to right, and as she did, Lester felt the warm sensation of urine run down his legs. First, he saw a massive shoulder, then a gigantic back, and finally a massive head. Immense arms encircled the legs, their thickness comparable to that of thick trees. In the room, there was a large child sitting with their back to Lester, holding a huge bag in front of them, from which they were slowly and clumsily trying to retrieve something. Lester did not even attempt to back away. If only it would work, he thought, pointing the gun at the massive creature. Click, misfire. With shaking hands, he tried to pull the bolt and point the gun back towards the darkness. Click, another misfire. Tears stung Lester's face. He tried pulling the trigger again, but nothing happened. Click, a misfire once more. "No, I do not play shooting games," said a child's voice calmly from the darkness. "Let's play my favorite game. If you win, you can leave safely. You just need to guess who I have guessed, and if you succeed, you will win." The child's joyful voice spoke. Lester, still monotonously pulling the bolt and pulling the trigger, did not expect anything anymore. He did not even have the strength to cry. "So, are we playing? Who did I wish for? A cat, a dog, or a child?" Lester's mind was blank and he didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know how to respond or what to say to a strange child in a dark room. Suddenly, the child began counting, 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 3 on a string. "The dog!" Lester yelled, frightened by his own voice. He pulled the trigger and a flash burst into the room. There was a loud crash, and for a few seconds, Lester's voice sounded cartoonish and fast. He was severely shocked and couldn't tell if he had hit the target or not. I couldn't hear what the child was saying clearly without stopping. "Wrong. Wrong. Wrong," the squeaky voice said over and over. "And the correct answer is bones." At the sound of the word bones, he turned around and began to pour the contents of the bag onto the floor. Lester stood rooted to the ground. Suddenly, something bounced at his feet. It was a long, white bone. When Lester saw it, he howled and ran downstairs. He huddled in the corner and began trying to pray. But at the age of 14, he didn't know a single prayer. So he repeated Our Father over and over again, without pause. It did not calm him down at all. The sound of the bones still pouring out of the bag kept breaking into his consciousness. Then, suddenly, there was a complete silence. When he opened his eyes, the sun was already rising outside. Birds were chirping outside the window, and life was going on as usual. For a moment, he even thought he must have dreamed all that. There was no gun, no bones, no nightmarish child, and no creepy baby. But everything was there, except the creepy child. He wasn't anywhere in the house. Lester walked around for about an hour, searching for the missing child. He tried to break down the door, hitting it with all his might. He even shot at the lock, but nothing happened. She didn't respond to his attempts in any way. Then he started trying to break the windows. First, he used the butt of his pistol, and then he used his hands and feet. Nothing happened. The bullets didn't even make a dent in them. Desperately, Lester went from room to room, looking for a way out. He saw an ordinary life going on outside the windows, but that very life had forgotten about him and didn't care. And he couldn't do anything about it. Worst of all, he realized that she didn't care either. He was lying on the floor with a gun in his hands, and he was thinking about what happened during the night. It felt like a long time ago. Now everything was calm, and nothing had happened in the last few hours. The most ordinary desires started to return to him. He suddenly remembered that he was hungry and thirsty. There wasn't a single faucet, sink, or toilet in the whole house. Just rusty, dry holes next to the floor. After searching the empty apartment 100 times, he slumped back in the corner of the kitchen again. Now, as the outside was getting dark, he started noticing how the house seemed to get bigger in front of his eyes. Fear returned to him, and he relapsed into continuous fear. His eyes soon got used to the dark, and his ears immediately registered any sound. He could just make out the outline of the dark doorway in the room where the creepy kid was. Then his ears picked up the first unusual sounds. It was another fumble. The creepy child did not seem to notice Lester's presence. He continued to quietly remove the bones from his bag and place them on the floor. Lester attempted to avoid looking at them. Then, the creepy child started humming a gentle tune to himself. When he heard it, Lester started to lose his composure. There was something about that melody that made Lester place the muzzle of a gun to his mouth. As if that tune was the breath between life and death, held in one person. It represented all human desires and fears. Her dreams, disappointments, and secret desires. Blood, meat, and bones. And dice, and then it was morning and the apartment was again empty. Lester's body had quickly lost its adolescent plumpness, and all the water seemed to have evaporated from it. Only a day had passed and Lester was already struggling to move around. And then days began to replace each other imperceptibly. During the lighter part of the day, he sat on the window seat and looked out at the yard. He had even seen Douglas and Robert a few times. They were happily walking back from the supermarket after dark. After dark, Lester disappeared into a world of death and desire. In this world, he forgot about the strange and huge child. In this world, he confused day from night. A week later, he saw for the first time what was outside his window at night. I saw the world through the eyes of this strange child who lived there. The houses opposite were ordinary houses in the daytime, but at night they looked like white skeletons with repeating dots of darkness. A white moon shone in the sky, while a nasty creature prowled around the yard. One day, Lester saw a man fall into his hands, and after that, he tried to avoid looking in that direction. Instead, he preferred to admire the bones of the trees, while the half-hearted song of death and lust played in his mind. Very soon, he started humming to himself. During the day, he looked at the people with disgust as they walked around the yard, disgusted at the fact that those beautiful bones were covered in meat, the ultimate purpose of which was to rot and decay. The blood in that meat was fake and could only curdle, and the bones were not like that. They would shine. After a couple of weeks in the apartment, Lester's body was all skin and bones. Bones. During rare moments of consciousness, he tried to reach for the black pistol that was lying next to him, but there also seemed to be a few bullets in it. I tried to get up or lift my head, but the skin on his legs was long gone and only white shining bones were visible. Bones. If he could have raised his neck and looked, he might have admired them. His clothes were no longer making sense, they were simply lying on the ground, and there were bones inside them. Bones. For some reason, lying on the floor under the wall, he sometimes became aware of himself. Sometimes he dreamed of the world, and Lester was there, and his bones. Bones. He sometimes recalled his life, his bizarre desires and fears. It was strange to him that he was afraid of bones spilling out of the bag. He also sometimes remembered some kind of Lester, some kind of gun, some kind of bones. I tried to remember Lester, because he was. He almost realized something. Though, until he realized that there was no Lester, but only bones. Bones, bones, bones.
Subscribe to the channel.